This is another Monday morning, and for people that tune in, I want to thank you folks for coming around. Got a few more photos and pointers in this one here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about. They usually pull up pictures I've taken and tell you why I've taken them, and spend a lot more time than I need to talking about each picture. But here, what do you think is going on here? This system has a full refrigerant charge. It's not cooling in these readings. So what does this tell you? What it tells me is that we have an expansion valve problem. Typically you don't see this as much with a fixed orifice system as you do one thermal expansion valve. But that's what's going on here. And you see a situation where you don't have this kind of number to begin with, and it cools okay, and then it pulls everything into the, the pressure on this side is in the negative. The pressure over here is not as high as it should be, and so they're struggling because of that restriction. When I worked at the Volkswagen place back in the 80s, we used to have Volkswagen Rabbits that would come in there, and the expansion would have, it had a screen in it that was supposed to stop from going through there. But the thing about it is that screen would stop up and cause this same, and some of the mechanics would get up in there and they'd take the line loose from that after getting the refrigerant out of it, and then they would just poke a hole in that screen, replacing the expansion valve. But anyway, that's what's going on here. We got a restriction in the expansion valve, and that's what's doing this. I told you about that Ford Edge, cool for 30 minutes and then quit cooling, and at the Ford place they were telling her she needed to spend $1,500 new evaporator housing with all the actuators. She brought it back over to the school because she worked at the college, and all I did was watch it for 30 minutes with the gauges on it, and this is the reading I got. And we put an valve on it for 16 bucks. We didn't charge labor, and she was good to go. Now this is the thing to me right here. When you've got an oil leak like this is on the power steering wheel, obviously, and it's from this angle, it's oddball. But when you see a leak like this, you're leaking, but there's not really any sort of fluid trace coming from above it. Not bad enough to where it's going to drip on the floor, and so you might want to clean off and see how quick that droplet appears again. But a lot of whenever Ford and GM, I used to say that if you had a drop like this of engine oil leak, but it never made it to the pavement, they weren't going to fix it under warranty, and they weren't going to do any work on an engine that was only burning a quart every 1,000 miles. Basically they had the idea that if you draw the line any different from that, they would be rebuilding engines all day, every day. So they basically got to be burning more than a quart every 1,000 miles before we're going to do anything with it. That was Ford and GM. I don't know what their policy was on that. I never looked that up, but anyway. But these little leaks like this are saying whenever you see that, because you'd kind of like to make the leak go away, but it doesn't. It's coming from here, and it may be coming from up this way, but who knows, It's obviously a power steering leak, and because it's clean there, you can tell that drop has time there, keeping this other stuff washed off. So that's one of the little mysterious things you usually don't have time to fool with, unless a customer happens to get under there and look at it. I want something done about this, then you're going to have to probably go in there and replace line. That's where I'd start, and make sure that it had a good seal in there. But anyway, one transmission mechanic at the Ford place over there, and he'd been a transmission mechanic for a long time. He was a good transmission mechanic, but he had one where that came back in there after he completely did the transmission and everything. Of course, you got oil and grease hands, and anybody that takes pride in their work is going to take some brake parts cleaner and wash all of the handprint off of the cross member and all this hogwash. And that customer, after the work was done, got under the truck and looked at it and complaining that he didn't clean the cross member. which I thought was really, but that transmission mechanic was fit to be tied about that. there was another guy looked under his drive shaft. He said, my drive shaft is rusty and this is a brand new truck and I don't think I rusty drive shaft. Now the drive shaft later on were aluminum, you know, so you didn't have them. But when the drive shafts were steel, they didn't paint the drive shaft at the factory in a lot of cases. You'd wind up with a rusty drive shaft. Not that it was a big deal, who cares? But the guy didn't like that. It's the new drive shaft shouldn't be rusty. Because, you know, you kind of look under there and see the drive shaft on a truck. And the service riders are trying to figure out what to do about that. And I said, I'll take care of that for you. I'll charge anything for it. So I took that thing and I was working in 2 flat stalls because most all I was doing was drive work. I didn't want to change the fuel pump. I just jack it up and put it on stands. But I raised the thing up, jack stands, spun that thing up, you know, the drive shaft up, ran a wire brush up and down it real good. While the drive shaft was spinning, then I cleaned all that dusty mess off of it. And then while it was spinning, I took a can of shiny black paint and I went all the way down that thing. It made a perfect paint, real easy and fun to do. The guy was super happy with that. That was the only time that I ever drive shaft. I didn't have to that time, but I did just to make the customer happy. And sometimes that's what we need to do, you know. Actually, you know, a lot of these transmissions that don't have dipsticks and stuff, you pump the fluid in this way. This is a Volkswagen, and there's a standpipe tool out of there, and you gotta pump this fluid in there, and it's got to be at a certain level and running all that. On the Ford Explorers, you got to do that. On a lot of vehicles, you got to do that. Some of the little, I think 3T40E transmissions on the GMs, you have dipstick, but you got to check the fluid by taking a plug out in the bottom while you pour the fluid in the top. Pour too much flows, it'll make it where it doesn't have any power, because it chokes everything down or whatever, and it doesn't even push it out the vent. For one was Volkswagen, we were putting the fluid in. We're using this, looks like a grease gun, but it's like a hinge. And we were pushing fluid into it through this clear tube. All that. One of the science instructor over there, he had this rabbit that he had us change transmission fluid in. Something that spooked me on that. This guy was a stickler for everything, and he bought a kit from Volkswagen to change his oil. And he liked to kind of get his hands on it, and since the college, and he was a sharp guy, and I liked him. And so I let him kind of have a hand in helping change his own. Didn't have a problem with that. That might raise your alarm bells if you're somebody that works in a shop. But this is different whenever running a shop at a college. And whenever the student was working with him too, and you know, the thing that we drain the oil in, that you roll over, you know, that you pump the oil out with air pressure and all. I noticed in that little tray on top of that thing, after he was gone and headed back to the town up the road where the main campus was, I noticed the oil drain plug on that tray, and it scared the daylights out of me. And I called his cell phone and I said, I see an oil drain plug there. Oh, he says, oh yeah, when I buy a kit from, you know, for oil, it comes with a new oil drain plug. And I was like, whoo, you know, you see an oil drain plug laying there after changing oil, it's just terrifying, you know, but in that particular case, it wasn't a big deal. This is that I bought this thing $500–600 at a time, bolted it to the wall. It was pretty cool. I had all these instructions on how to set it up and all, and it would squeeze the spring, you know. Kinds of ways of doing this. I had one student who never would. I had a worksheet where you're supposed to pull a strut off of a car, break it down with this machine back together, and put it back on the car, you know, mark it so that the camber wouldn't be that kind of thing. And this one student did a lot of other worksheets, but he never did that one. And so the next semester he came back and he had to put a timing belt on one that you had strut out of on the passenger side. And because he had never done this sheet and didn't know how a strut was put together, he just put an impact wrench on the bolt in the car, you know, fortunately, and took that nut off, and it just got boing apart, and it was laying in pieces on the bench. And I came over and said, what the heck happened here? You know, you expect to see the cymbal strut where they pulled it off. You know, you're supposed to take your 3 nuts off out here, 2 bolts off down here, and unhook the stuff that's hooked to it and get it out. That guy made a mess out of that. That's what happens when you don't do the worksheets. This one guy refused to do the worksheets. They could do, there were certain things they had to do. There wasn't any one worksheet that would fail them, but they get lower, you know, some worksheets counted for more than others. But one refused to do a ball joint worksheet because he just didn't really like the idea of having to change out a ball joint because it looked like it was too hard. This is this same guy, and I'm not this guy here. This guy was a good student, did whatever I told him to. But that other guy, I told him, I says that we were going to replace the, you know, the back of the tailpipe on the end where it, right at the back end where it comes out from under the truck. And it's in that one spot, but the rest of it was good and fairly solid. And I says, well, the guy that owns this truck doesn't want the whole tailpipe replaced, he just wants this rusty part replaced. And so I said, what I want you to do is take a hacksaw and cut this pipe off right here, and then we're going to put a little, you know, extension pipe on it like they sell at the parts house, little elbow, and we'll put a clamp on it. And that knothead would not pick up a hacksaw. He says, do you have a sawzall or some power tool I can use? And so I grabbed the hacksaw, went to that spot where I told him to cut it off, and I worked that hacksaw for about 30 seconds and that down on the floor. And I said, now why in the Sam Hill did you need a power tool for this? Well, that same guy, he would do the ball joints. And whenever he went, and I didn't get him a job because I really didn't have confidence in the guy, and I felt like he would fall on his face. So I let him find that particular guy. And he found his own job, and the first ticket they handed him was ball pickup truck, and he absolutely could not do them. And he made a fool out of himself, and I was glad that I wasn't the one that played job. Now this right here, this is the same student you saw in the previous picture. We had a situation where the cross member needed to be put back on, and the threads were all messed up in here. Now this was something, you know, it's a temptation just to put one here, right? You can't put a nut on the top because it's all sealed up in here, and you know, hardened, you know, nut that's welded up in there. So I showed him, I said, what you're going to do here, get a 1.5 thread pitch 10 millimeter tap, and you're going to tap threads up in there. I didn't make a picture of it, but I replaced a CD Blu-ray drive in my home theater computer yesterday, and I ordered one to replace the other one that had, you know, that wasn't, for some reason I built the computer, I mean upgraded the computer with a new motherboard, and the motherboard couldn't see the existing drive for some reason. So I ordered another Blu-ray drive, and so I was mounting the carriage on that thing. I had to pull this thing out to mount the drive, and I kept trying to put those square, you know, to mount that drive, and they wouldn't ever go, wouldn't start, and so 3 millimeter holes in that thing. I got down there with a flashlight, the holes in that new drive had threads in it. Duh. So I had to get a 3 millimeter thread tap and I threads in the drive so that I could mount it in the computer. And I went on Newegg and I told them what I thought. This was ridiculous. The thing worked great once I got it put in the computer, but having to tap holes, well, you know, I guess somebody in a computer shop might do it, but a regular DIY person, if I just was good that I had a tap and die set that had a 3 millimeter tap. Of course, I could have gone and bought. Anyway, tapping these threads so that you could put a bolt in there is something that's really, it's tempting just to say, well, one bolt will hold it, and I'll just zip that up in there, you know. This is teaching us the right way to do something, if you understand what I'm saying. Now, that's not my hand. I took a picture of it tapping those threads up in there. But that's just a smart way to do that. Alright, this one here is a Autocraft tool from Advanced Auto Parts that have what it took to pull this Pitman arm off of this Bronco. Big Bronco. That was very annoying to me because the thing looks fairly substantial. You know, it looks like they made it where it seemed like it should have worked, and it even fit up in here, but it was not strong at all. You can't hit this thing, and you can't hit that thing. If you hit that or you hit that, heat this, I mean, nothing really is going to work like that, because if you heat this, you're going to have a leak and seal. If you hit that, you're going to damage what's up in here. So you got to use a puller to pull this off the right way. I had to get a better puller to do this, but you know, that Autocraft puller would usually do the job, but on this one, that was what it took. Now this is a funny story here. We were replacing the crank deal in a vehicle. Can't remember. The crankshaft seal that they sent, the students kept comparing it with this seal here. saying this is not seal because it doesn't look the same. This is not the right seal because it doesn't look the same. Well, it turned out, and not holding their hand or looking over their shoulder all the time, well, it turned out that this we're comparing it to, they had picked up from a bench back there that was close to where they were working. We came from something totally different. And so we kept telling the parts guy the seal was wrong, and he was really, because the knothead students, and this was just how, you know, the buck stops with me, this kept comparing the seal he was sending with this wrong seal that didn't fit the carton again. And he was sending the right seal every time. That was one of the times, you know, I talk about part stores. This is the time that buffooned out of ourselves like that. Just other parts, and I don't really like talking to a part I don't know, but had this one part, got picked. I called the part store and picked up the phone. I tell he's a young kid I ain't ever talked to before. Nobody else was there but him. I said, okay, I'm gonna give you like talking to a parts man I don't know, but let's see how you do. I said, I need a lug nut for a 2007 Toyota. He said, front or rear? I knew I was in big trouble. This right here was an interesting thing. This is a truck that had 35 miles on it. It came from Ford Motor Company. I had requested see if any Trainer vehicles to give me back in 2001. This is a 98 Ranger with a 3-liter in it. It only had 35 miles on it when I got it, but it had been underwater, and it came from a dealership in Highland Park, and there had been a flood up there. And we used this thing for a Trainer truck for many, many, many years. And we did all kinds of stuff with this truck. It was a wonderful Trainer truck for us to use. Couldn't drive it on the road, couldn't take any parts off and put it on anything else, because that's the way it is with Trainer vehicles. But this particular one, this you saw with the safety glasses in the previous slide, he was changing out. He had part of the steering and suspension. He had to pull the racking off and put it back on, tighten it up, and bleed the steering out so it wouldn't leak. I mean, and get the air out of it and make sure it wasn't leaking and all that. That was a worksheet. This is on a Trainer truck, and so fairly easy to do on this 98 Ranger. And so I went ahead and that job. And so he did the job, and he was really a conscientious student. He backs the thing out. It was running for a while. He was, you know, checking closed the hood, and he checked the under it one last time. It worked good. He backed it into this parking place, and somebody came driving by about 6 or 8 minutes later and noticed smoke coming from under the hood. And this engine had fire right here in the alternator area. Now that boy didn't cause that. There's no way by changing the rack, steering rack. But it's like the alternator got hot. For some reason it was a big enough of a burn job mess that I couldn't tell. I knew it started in this area around the alternator, and the alternator looked to me like there weren't oil leaks or anything like that. It was an electrical fire of sorts, just due to heat. That vehicle should have been fixed back up, and it wouldn't have been all that much, but this was close to the time that I retired. And so I got around to fixing it. I think they wound up auctioning this vehicle off, which they weren't supposed to do, because it had a branded title. You know, a salvage yard might have been able to pull an engine out of it, not supposed to anyway. Any Trainer vehicle that comes from a manufacturer is going to have a branded title, and you tag for it. That's typically the way that works. Now this is these guys' engine in a Trailblazer. Kind of a funny situation here. I was standing under that Trailblazer talking to a student, and he didn't, either one of these guys, they were part of that job, but it wasn't either one of these guys, and they were putting this thing down in there, settled in at the time, and I was under that same black Trailblazer, you know, directing the student on how to connect everything and all that kind of stuff, a different student. That guy, for some reason, didn't talk plain all the time. He was a normal guy, but he just, communication skills were, you know, and so I'm standing here talking to him, and he looked over my shoulder and he kept saying, and I said, what? What are you saying? And finally I parsed what he was saying. He said there were people there. And so I looked over the congresswoman, you know, for our state, and about 6 feet behind me with her entourage of people. I didn't even know she was there. But this bit, you know, I don't understand that. Whenever somebody says something that was fairly important anyway, I had to go and engage with the congresswoman and her staff. But this here was a really, really, really good student, and very sharp. This guy right here, you can't see his face, fortunately. He finished the program, and I gave him, I sent him to an interview to get, and he scheduled the interview. Went to the interview, they hired him. He was supposed to be back the next morning to go to work. He never showed. They called me, and when it was, I called him, and he said he just decided he wasn't going to go to work there. I mean, it basically threw me under the bus, because he was all the way down to, he had been hired and everything, but he did that, you know, he didn't want to go to work there. I don't know why he didn't tell the guy that or call the guy or something, but there's a lot going on there. This right here was something that we had to do on a Ford Edge, where there was issues going on, and I don't remember what they were with this here, that had to do with the climate control and all, and the radio and human interface. So this is where I was reprogramming that. I had the IDS there that, you know, we used for that, and that was I taught the students how to do all kinds of stuff. I ran the place over there like a shop. Anybody that's read my Motor Age articles, you can read about all that we've done over there. Now this was Noah. For some reason he showed up in several of these. Whenever you take the caliper off, it's a good idea, and we'd build these little S-hooks, you know. Hang that caliper up, don't let it swing by the hose. I've gone in a lot of shops and I've seen caliper swinging by. Not a good plan. He was doing an on-car brake lathe job right here. Now you got to be this on some of your Mercedes vehicles. If you do that on the rear brakes, you'll wind up getting a bunch of filings on the anti-lock brake sensor, and you'll have a light that may be hard to get rid of. This one right here, torquing the caliper brackets. You'd be surprised how much that is on those caliper brackets, but most guys just run that thing up with an air wrench or an impact wrench. But I taught myself to do that. And this good friend of mine took his Volkswagen 2013, I think it was, whatever. He's got a V10 diesel in that thing, but anyway, he took it to get the tires rotated at a shop usually uses over there, and they left a bunch of the lugs loose a few days ago, so that in South Carolina, so that the wheel was wobbling. His wife knew right away something was wrong, and they had to torque them. And I told my students to torque them with a lug wrench. I mean, with a torque wrench. I said, torque them with a torque wrench, and that way, if you torque them with a torque wrench, you're less likely to leave any of them loose. But if you're all up with an impact wrench, you'd be surprised how many people leave lug nuts loose. And what happens is, when they go to a shop, whoever it is that's running the shop will have this idea that that's stupid and it takes too much time, and they just tell them don't do that, and just run it up with an impact wrench. So all of the the teaching out the window that I would do. Also tell them I don't put any sealer of any kind on a gasket. If the surface looks good, put a little bit of grease or something to hold the gasket in place. I just put the gasket on there with clean surfaces. You have a bunch of Gorilla Snot to put on there, but some shops want you to put that on both sides of the gasket for some reason or another. It was kind of wacky, I thought. I was running into students that what I taught them at the college would wind up getting tossed aside once they get to a shop, you know. Now this rear end in this vehicle was on the pinion shaft came apart. You can see where that had made its signature on there. That rear end was just totally destroyed. And this was a student, I got a salvage yard rear end, and he had to replace the rear end. That was another worksheet we did on that Ranger or one of the other vehicles. I have them pull the rear end out and replace it. And so anyway, that was what was going on here. Now this Ford stoplight switch could be an annoying job to do, and I would have them do that. Now that one guy, you might remember the Bronco that knocked the other car off the lift. That one guy was replacing a kind of a heavy set guy, and he just left this disconnected without telling anybody on the big Bronco that we had. He started the worksheet, just time to go, went home, left it with no brakes, and a goofy student was going to back it out the next morning and didn't think to put his foot on the brake because it was just swinging the disconnect push rod because the guy had pulled that. Anyway, and whenever he went somehow he managed to get it instead of reverse, and it went forward. He panicked and he couldn't do anything to stop it, and blah blah mess like that. This right here was a leak around Victoria, I forgot which. It had a huge water leak that was pouring out of this valley because that little coolant, it connects here, carrying out of the water pump, two O-rings. It just slides onto there, and then it's got a strap back here. This one right here. To get by on this one, temporarily we actually cut this here and here. And put a rubber hose on there, because at the time we were sort of under the gun, needed to get that car A. But there's a lot of we had to pull the intake manifold off to get to this. That's not when you got a plastic intake. You can get the thing off in 20 minutes. Now this was on my Explorer. Whenever I replaced the radiator, and we replaced the radiator on this thing. You got to have a special tool on that one, the factory radiator, to disconnect the coolant lines. The radiator coolant lines. And we put this, and this thing was just transmission fluid out of here, and you're trying to figure out what the sound mill is going on because it's got O-rings up in here. Well, when you look in there, this O-ring right here was all botched up. It's not a bad putting a radiator on there before you snap these lines in there to have a look in that hole, make sure there's not one of them O-rings. So this thing's tapered off in the front. It didn't mess that O-ring going up in there. It can't. And but on that particular vehicle, I bought my radiator at about, I'm going to say probably 70,000 miles, started leaking. And of course 6 model, and it was about 15 years old at the time. And so I said, let's go ahead and put a radiator in. So I bought a radiator, put it in there. I got another radiator, and this one, Chinese made radiators. Put that in there, it leaked. Through 4 radiators. Finally, the 4th one, I said, I'm going to pay the extra and let y'all get me one from Ford. So store Advanced Auto Parts got me one from Ford, and I paid the extra. And I put that in there, and it's been in there, it's been like 5 years ago or 6. And it hadn't leaked anymore after that. But I got so annoyed with Chinese radiators, and then every time you turn around, it's leaking. And the radiator in that Explorer is not easy to change. It's annoying. Now this guy right here was a work-study student, and I said, what happened to your auto? When I opened his hood, he didn't know anything about vehicles, big old strong guy. And he said, well, I quit starting, and I called somebody, and they told me to hit the starter with a hammer, and I thought that was the starter, and so I hit it. He hit the alternator with a hammer and busted it. Now, it was still putting out and all that, but that's kind of embarrassing. You open the hood and you got a busted alternator because you hit it with a hammer. I didn't laugh at him or make fun of him or anything, but that's what happened. Plastic stuff tends to break. Some of these gas tanks, somebody paying attention when they pull a gas tank off, they'll have some little nipple that's made onto the gas tank on some of these Dodges. That little thing off, you're just about going to have a gas tank unless you got some kind of way to fix it. This little plastic piece broke here, this plastic radiator cracked, this plastic T came from hardware that had been put on there to begin with, but it cracked and leaked. But they got all kinds of plastic stuff, and some of this plastic stuff, when you break it, it's not, I used to tell the students, don't think it's real easy to call the part store and get a replacement part for something like this, because you can't find that part anywhere except the dealer, and it comes with a much larger part that's very expensive. Because it's plastic doesn't mean it's cheap, you know what I mean? This right here was a bunch of trash that was in a well next to the spark plug. Trying to put your socket down in there, it won't go on the plug. And you try and you can't get it out, can't get it out, can't get it out. And, so you look down in here, we use the borescope setting on the Autel tool for this. And that thing had its trash down in there that fell in the hole. It's always a good idea to take a blower. If you ever remove the coils on one of these cop coil vehicles or anything that's got welds where the plugs are, blow all of that crud off the top of the engine. Because if you pull that coil and stuff falls down in there, you're going to have a problem. And that's the kind of, we had stuff that fell in there. Furthermore, if you manage to get the plug out and there's trash in there that falls on down in the cylinder, you got a bigger. And so here we go. Well, we had to get that nonsense out of there. You got to find out, why can't I get the socket to go on the plug, Yeah, had them put a clutch in one here. That's really a story there, we were saying. So I called the parts store and I said, how much is a clutch for this vehicle? Some kind of Chevrolet thing, I can't remember what it was. $400. $400 for a clutch is ridiculous. So I called $400. I said, that's stupid. Just for grins, I called the dealer. I mean, 150 bucks. And it was a Sachs clutch, S-A-C-H-S, same brand as what at the parts store, but it was only 150 bucks at the dealer. What's wrong with this picture? Well, the O'Reilly's guy came out and said, why are you trying to charge me $400 for a clutch that I can get for 150 from the dealer? And he looked around and called and he said, well, the best I could do would be 190 on that clutch. And I said, well, why were you charging me $400 for it? He said, well, we just charge whatever the market will bear. I thought that one, and that guy was they're trying to get me to start buying all my parts from O'Reilly's. I don't think so. Against O'Reilly's, but that ticked me off. Here's this gal working on this 71 Eldorado. Look at all the distance there is between there and the radiator. They made this thing really long. You had lots of room in there on that one there. It was always a lot of fun. We did quite a bit of work on that for the guy that owned it. This right here was this Buick. You can actually start, look at all these codes. Here would start and die and do crazy things whenever you was firing it up. And you all these codes, and you're getting catalyst system codes, throttle body, airflow performance, mass flow stuff, and you're thinking, what's wrong with it? And you start chasing all of this other stuff if you're not careful. Miss the actual problem that it has, which I had mentioned this one time before. We use this Wacom Hickok recorder, which you can't even buy anymore except from these tool sales people that bought out the stock that Hickok. I guess this didn't sell very well, so Hickok didn't make these anymore. But I had bought one at the school. It only has fuels to record. It's got battery, it's got ignition, and it'll record fuel injector pulse. It will record the fuel injector pulse, ignition, and else you decided to pick at random, and battery. And we actually found out along with this by using that, and it turned out that this cam sensor was shorted out. That wire had, and it would touch the balancer when the balancer was spinning because it was right next to it, and sometimes it wouldn't. And there, so we wound up having to put a pigtail on there, and I took that picture for that reason. But on this 07 Lucerne, it was a college car. It belonged to the college, and a couple of different executives drove it. But this doggone thing is giving wacky trouble. And initially we thought it was the fuel pump because the fuel pressure was bleeding off and all that. But all of these other codes will lead you astray, and none pointed at the cam sensor. Not a single code on there had anything to say about the cam sensor. But order, which you can still buy this Wacom Hickok flight recorder. The thing about it is, if you pick the wrong thing to monitor besides injector pulse, ignition, and battery, you're not going to see it anyway. But the long and short of it is, this recorder was what helped us with that, took care of it. End of story. This was the shop right up on a Thursday noon when I was there after the students left. It had been freshly cleaned, and one vehicle on the lift over there. So I really appreciate you guys coming by, and we've been here almost 34 minutes. I'll see you next week, and I hope you lasted until the last slide. Have a great week.